Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with yours truly.
Happy to be here.
Today we're tackling a pretty hot topic, you could say, wildfires in the US.
Definitely a hot topic and a timely one. It's a fascinating area with a lot of interesting history and science to uncover.
Right, did you know that the average area burned by wildfires has almost tripled in the last 30 years?
Yeah, it's a pretty staggering statistic. It really highlights the growing scale of the problem.
Yeah, that's like a whole Delaware going up in flames every single year. It's kind of hard to even imagine.
It really puts things into perspective, and it speaks to the urgency of addressing this issue.
So where do we even begin? I guess, what are the basics of wildfires? When and where do they happen most?
Well, most wildfires in the U.S. occur in the western states and Florida.
Okay, that makes sense. Dry climates, it's lots of forests.
Exactly, and those areas are particularly prone to dry lightning storms, which are a major natural ignition source.
Okay, so lightning is a big factor.
Yeah, but it's not the only one. Human activities also play a significant role.
Oh yeah, I've heard about things like careless campfires or even arson.
Right, those are definitely contributing factors. But even things like faulty equipment or downed power lines can spark a wildfire.
So it's kind of a combination of natural and human factors at play.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that fire itself isn't inherently bad. It's a natural part of many ecosystems.
That's right. I remember learning about how some forests actually depend on fire to regenerate.
Exactly. It's a process called fire ecology. And it's fascinating how these ecosystems have evolved to not just survive, but actually thrive with fire.
So how did we get to this point where wildfires have become such a massive problem? I mean, historically, haven't we always tried to put out every fire?
Yeah, for much of the 20th century, the dominant approach to wildfire management was aggressive suppression.
I remember Smokey Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires.
Exactly. Smokey Bear is a product of that era. The idea was that all fire was bad, especially for timber resources. So we poured a lot of resources into putting out every blaze we could.
But it sounds like that strategy might have backfired a bit.
Yeah, starting in the 1970s, ecologists started to realize that suppressing all fires was actually disrupting natural processes and could even make things worse in the long run.
Like?
Well, by preventing smaller natural fires, we were allowing fuel to build up in forests, dead trees, underbrush, all that flammable stuff.
So it's like we were basically creating a giant tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
Exactly. And when those sparks inevitably happened, the fires were much larger and more intense because they had so much fuel to burn.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the approach now? Are we just letting all fires burn?
It's not quite that simple. We've moved towards a more nuanced approach that recognizes the role of fire in the ecosystem while still prioritizing the protection of human lives and property.
So it's about finding a balance.
Exactly. We're using a combination of strategies, including prescribed burns, mechanical fuel reduction, and of course, suppression when necessary.
Prescribed burns, those are the ones where they intentionally set fires, right?
Right. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually a really effective way to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires by mimicking the natural role of fire in the ecosystem.
So it's kind of like controlled chaos.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about managing fire rather than just trying to eliminate it altogether.
And what about this thing I keep hearing about the Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI? I feel like that's got to be a big part of this whole wildfire problem.
It absolutely is. The WUI is basically the zone where human development meets wildland areas.
Okay, so like houses built on the edge of a forest or in those scenic canyons.
Exactly. And as more people move into these areas, the risk of wildfire impacts increases significantly.
Yeah, because those homes are basically in the line of fire.
Right. And it raises some tough questions about responsibility risk management and the cost of living in high-risk areas.
Like, who pays for all the firefighting efforts when a wildfire breaks out?
That's a big question, and the costs are staggering. Battling a single large wildfire can cost tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars.
Whoa, that's a lot of money.
It is, and it's important to remember that those early fire suppression efforts that we talked about are actually a big reason why today's fires are so expensive to fight.
How so?
Well, by suppressing fires for decades, we essentially created a massive backlog of fuel in our forests.
So now when fires do occur, they're much larger and more intense and require a lot more resources to contain.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how short-term thinking can lead to long-term consequences.
And on top of all that, we have climate change, which I'm guessing doesn't exactly help the situation.
Climate change is a major factor in the increasing wildfire threat. It's like adding fuel to the fire, literally.
Yeah, I can see how hotter temperatures and drier conditions would make wildfires more likely.
Exactly. Climate change is creating a perfect storm for wildfires by increasing the frequency and intensity of heat waves, droughts, and extreme weather events.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The more we disrupt the climate, the more we increase the risk of wildfires, and then those wildfires release even more carbon into the atmosphere, further exacerbating climate change.
You got it. It's a complex, interconnected issue with far-reaching implications.
So we've got these sort of like historical factors with fire suppression, and then we've got the growing issue of the WUI, and then on top of that we have climate change as this like overarching threat multiplier.
It's a lot to grapple with, and it underscores the urgency of finding solutions that address the root causes of the problem.
Okay, well, let's dive into some of those solutions then. What are we doing to combat this growing wildfire threat?
Well, there's a lot of promising developments on the horizon, new technologies, innovative strategies, and a growing awareness of the need for a more holistic approach to wildfire management.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, for starters, we're seeing major advancements in wildfire prediction and early detection.
Like how?
Researchers are using things like sophisticated computer models, satellite imagery, and even artificial intelligence to better understand fire behavior and predict where and when wildfires are most likely to occur.
So it's kind of like a weather forecast, but for wildfires.
Exactly. The more accurate these predictions are, the better prepared we'll be to allocate resources, stage firefighting crews, and even issue early warnings to communities at risk.
That sounds incredibly valuable, especially for those living in the WUI. A heads up could make all the difference in terms of evacuations and minimizing damage.
Precisely. And we're also seeing advancements in firefighting technology itself. Drones are being used to map fire perimeters, assess fuel loads, and even drop fire retardant in hard-to-reach areas.
Drones fighting fires, that's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But it's becoming a reality. And there are other high-tech tools in development, like laser-based ignition systems that can be used for more precise and controlled prescribed burns.
Wow, technology is really changing the game when it comes to wildfire management. But what about the human element? What role does individual responsibility play in all of this?
It's absolutely crucial. We can have all the technology in the world, but if people aren't taking steps to protect themselves and their property, it won't be enough. Simple things like creating defensible space around your home, clearing brush and debris, and being careful with fire sources can significantly reduce your risk.
Defensible space. That's one of those terms I've heard thrown around but never fully understood. What does that actually entail?
It basically means creating a buffer zone around your home where vegetation is trimmed back or removed to slow or stop the spread of wildfire. Think of it like a moat protecting a castle. The wider the moat, the better the defense.
Now I get it. Makes sense. So it's not just about clearing out your immediate yard, but also thinking about the surrounding area and working with your neighbors, maybe.
Exactly. It's a community effort. And it's also important for people to have an evacuation plan in place just in case. Know your evacuation routes, pack a go bag with essentials, and be prepared to leave quickly if an evacuation order is issued.
Being prepared, that's a message we hear a lot. But it's especially important when it comes to wildfires. These fires can move so quickly, you might have very little time to react.
That's right. And preparedness doesn't just apply to individuals. Communities need to have robust wildfire mitigation plans in place, including things like fuel reduction projects, building codes that promote fire-resistant construction, and well-trained first responders.
So it's really a multi-pronged approach involving everyone from individual homeowners to government agencies and researchers.
It really is. And it's not just about reacting to wildfires, it's about proactively managing the landscape to reduce risk. This includes things like promoting sustainable forestry practices, restoring fire-adapted ecosystems, and addressing climate change, which is a major driver of the increasing wildfire threat.
Right, climate change.
Yeah.
That's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It feels like everything we've talked about so far, fuel buildup, drier conditions, longer fire seasons, is being amplified by a warming climate.
You're absolutely right. Climate change is a major factor in this equation, and it's something we need to address urgently. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is crucial if we want to slow the pace of warming and mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, including more intense and frequent wildfires.
So it's not just about putting out fires, it's about addressing the root causes of the problem and working towards long-term solutions.
Exactly. It's a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
We're moving away from a purely reactive approach to one that's more proactive, holistic, and focused on long-term sustainability. It's about finding ways to live with fire rather than constantly fighting against it.
That's an interesting way to frame it, living with fire. It acknowledges that fire is a natural part of many ecosystems, and that trying to eliminate it completely is not only futile but potentially counterproductive.
Precisely. It's about understanding the role of fire in the landscape and managing it in a way that's both beneficial and safe.
I like that, managing fire instead of fearing it. It sounds like a more balanced and sustainable approach.
It is, and it requires a shift in mindset. We need to start seeing fire as a tool, not just a threat. A tool that can be used to promote ecosystem health, reduce wildfire risk, and even enhance biodiversity.
Well, that's definitely a lot to think about, and we've only just scratched the surface of this complex issue. But I think it's a good starting point for a deeper dive into the world of wildfires. So join us next time as we explore some of the specific strategies and technologies being used to manage wildfire risk and build a more fire-resilient future.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, a lot to think about. And that actually leads perfectly into where I think we should go next.
Okay, cool. Wait on me.
Well, we've talked about the problem, the history, the scale of this wildfire issue. But what are we actually doing about it? What's being done to, fight back?
Right, because it can't all be doom and gloom. There's got to be some hope out there, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's some seriously cool stuff happening. A lot of it is about being smarter and more proactive. Not just reacting when a fire breaks out.
Okay, so like what kind of stuff?
Well, one big area is wildfire prediction. We're getting way better at actually forecasting where and when fires are likely to happen.
Wait, so like a weather forecast, but for wildfires?
Exactly. It's using computer models, satellite imagery, even AI to analyze all this data about weather, vegetation, all the ingredients for a fire.
Okay, that's wild. So we could know weeks or even months in advance where the high-risk zones are going to be.
Well, we're not quite there yet, but the technology is improving rapidly, and the more accurate those predictions get, the better we can prepare, right?
Yeah, I mean, that could be huge for evacuations, giving people enough time to get out of harm's way.
Exactly. And for allocating resources strategically, making sure firefighters and equipment are in the right place at the right time.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So prediction, that's one thing. What else is happening on the cutting edge?
Oh, tons of stuff. We're seeing drones being used more and more in firefighting.
Drones fighting fires. That sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, it's pretty sci-fi. But they're incredibly useful. They can map fire perimeters, assess fuel loads, even drop fire retardant in areas that are too dangerous for humans to reach.
Okay, I can see how that would be game-changing.
Yeah.
So basically, technology is giving us a whole new arsenal to combat these fires.
Absolutely. But tech isn't the whole story, right? There's still the human element to all of this. We can have the best tools in the world, but if people aren't taking responsibility for their own safety and doing their part to reduce risk, it's not going to be enough.
Okay, so what does that look like? What can individuals actually do to protect themselves and their property?
Well, one of the most important things is creating defensible space around your home.
Defensible space, I've heard that term, but I'm not exactly sure what it means.
It's basically creating a buffer zone around your house where vegetation is cleared back or trimmed to slow or stop the spread of wildfire. Think of it like a moat protecting a castle. The wider the moat, the better the defense. Oh, okay. That makes sense. So clearing out brush and debris, keeping your lawn mowed, keeping trees trimmed away from your house.
Exactly. And it's not just about your immediate yard either. It's about working with your neighbors to create a defensible zone for the whole community.
Right, because a fire doesn't care about property lines.
Exactly. And on top of defensible space, it's also crucial to have an evacuation plan in place.
Yeah.
Just in case. Your evacuation roads have a go bag packed with essentials. Be ready to go at a moment's notice.
Being prepared. Yeah, that's a message we hear all the time. But it's especially important with wildfires. I mean, these things can move so fast.
Absolutely. You might only have minutes to get out. So being prepared can literally be the difference between life and death.
And preparedness doesn't just apply to individuals, right? Communities as a whole need to be thinking about this stuff.
Absolutely. It's about having robust wildfire mitigation plans in place.
Yeah.
That means things like fuel reduction projects, building codes that promote fire-resistant construction, and well-trained first responders. So it's really a multi-layered approach. Everyone from individual homeowners to local governments to scientists and researchers all working together to tackle this problem.
It really is a team effort. And it's not just about reacting to wildfires, it's about proactively managing the landscape to reduce risk.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, it involves things like promoting sustainable forestry practices, restoring fire-adapted ecosystems, and, addressing climate change, which is a major driver of this whole mess.
Right, climate change. The elephant in the room. It feels like everything we've talked about so far, fuel buildup, drier conditions, longer fire seasons, it's all being made worse by a warming planet.
You're absolutely right. Climate change is amplifying the wildfire threat in a big way. And it's something we need to address urgently if we want to get ahead of this problem.
So it's not just about putting out fires. It's about tackling the underlying causes and creating a more sustainable and resilient future.
Exactly. It's about changing our relationship with fire. recognizing that it's a force of nature that can be both destructive and beneficial.
It's about learning to live with fire, rather than constantly trying to fight against it.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between respecting the power of fire and managing it in a way that's safe for both people and the environment.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The science, the strategies, the tech. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, what does the future hold for wildfires?
Yeah, are we headed towards a world where these mega fires just become the norm?
Well, it's definitely a possibility if we don't take action, but I also see a lot of reasons for hope.
Okay, I need some of that hope right now.
Well, for one thing, the conversation around wildfire is changing. We're starting to see it as a global issue, not just a problem for the Western U.S. or for, summertime.
Yeah, it seems like every year we're seeing wildfires in places that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago, like the Arctic even.
Exactly, and that's a wake-up call. It's a reminder that this is all connected to larger forces like climate change.
So it's not enough to just focus on putting out the fires. We have to address the root causes of the problem.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive one. And that means looking at things like land management practices, development patterns, and of course our carbon emissions.
So it's a pretty fundamental shift in how we approach this whole issue.
It is. It's about recognizing that fire is a force of nature. And rather than trying to eliminate it completely, we need to learn to coexist with it in a way that's both safe and sustainable.
I've heard some people talk about the need to rekindle our relationship with fire. Like instead of fearing it, we need to understand it, respect it, even harness its power for good.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that perspective.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities have been practicing cultural burning for centuries, using fire as a tool to manage landscapes, promote biodiversity, enhance ecosystem health.
That's a great point. It's about acknowledging that we're not the only ones who have a relationship with fire. It's been a part of this planet for millions of years, and ecosystems have evolved to adapt to it.
Exactly. And when we disrupt those natural cycles, whether through fire suppression or, through the effects of climate change, we create imbalances that can lead to more severe and destructive wildfires.
So what does a more fire-adapted future look like? What kind of changes need to happen?
Well, for one thing, we need to prioritize fuel reduction efforts on a much larger scale. That means expanding prescribed burning programs, supporting mechanical thinning projects, and even exploring innovative approaches like grazing with livestock to manage vegetation growth.
Like using goats as firefighters. I heard about that.
Yeah, it sounds a little crazy, but it can be surprisingly effective. And it has the added benefit of supporting biodiversity and sustainable agriculture.
Okay, so fuel reduction, that's one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
What about individual homeowners? What can we do to make our properties more fire resistant?
A lot, actually. Simple things like creating defensible space around your home using fire-resistant landscaping materials, making sure your roof and gutters are clear of debris. These things can make a big difference.
And of course, having an evacuation plan in place just in case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Know your escape routes have a go bag packed. Stay informed about fire conditions in your area. Those things can be life-saving.
So preparedness is key both on an individual level and a community level.
Exactly. And beyond those practical measures, I think there's also a need for a broader cultural shift. We need to start talking about wildfire risk more openly and honestly, educating ourselves about the science and advocating for policies that promote fire-resilient communities.
So it's about empowering individuals, but also holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. Wildfire is a complex issue with no easy answers. But the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges ahead and create a future where we can live safely and sustainably alongside fire.
Well, this has been a real eye-opener, kind of a sobering topic, but also fascinating, and ultimately I think there's reason for hope.
I agree. It's a challenging issue, but it's not insurmountable. With the right knowledge, the right tools, and the right mindset, we can create a more fire-resilient future.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into wildfires in the U.S. I hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here, so keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, stay curious.